I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about Chapter 3 of The Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir. The title of this chapter is The Positive Aspect of Ambiguity. This chapter is a long one, comprising 5 parts, so I'll probably record my thoughts on Chapter 3 in 2 or 3 videos. The first part is called The Aesthetic Attitude. The world and its objects only have value and meaning when human beings ascribe to them value and meaning. Otherwise, they are just objects which in themselves have no intrinsic value. Since humanity's broad aim is to disclose the world through our own freedom, in the same way we want others also to be free so that we can then have overall more disclosure of the world. However, if we are already ontologically free, then whatever we do, be it good or evil, we are already disclosing the world through our ontological freedom, making no solution better or worse than any other. De Beauvoir calls this way of thinking the aesthetic attitude, since those with such an attitude view their relation to the world as one of detached contemplation, taking what is seemingly an amoral attitude. She elaborates. As the aesthete sees it, the important thing is merely to understand the temporary events and through them cultivate that beauty which perishes not. She believes that the aesthetic attitude is one of escapism. While such an attitude may be legitimate with regards to the past which is no longer changeable, it is not legitimate with regards to the present. The present is not a potential past. It is the moment of choice and action, she writes. The present is not just the way it appears to be. It is a function of choices made in the past, the same way the future is determined by choices made in the present. If one simply contemplates what is happening around him and tries to stand outside it, he deludes himself since he is still within his society. He will be effectively siding with the oppressor through his inaction, hence making the aesthetic attitude not amoral but immoral. The writer and artist are free to express good and evil in their works, but sometimes the aesthetic representation is so striking that it betrays the author's aim. Her example is a book on child labor written so beautifully that it seems to justify the suffering of the victims, where such suffering seems needed and worthwhile even in order that such a great work of art can be produced. While the past cannot be changed for the child laborers, all that we can do is to reveal it, to integrate it into the human heritage, to raise it to the dignity of the aesthetic existence which bears within itself its finality. Like everyone else, the artist is situated in the world and must find it within himself to will freedom for himself and everyone else. With this in mind, he can then assess the suitability of what and how he creates artistically. De Beauvoir does not elaborate on this further, but I think one way to understand this is to consider whether by depicting child labor, is the writer promoting that evil as an act of propaganda and glorification of such labor, or is his aim noble, perhaps to evoke the horrors of such oppression for the consideration of his readers? If it is the latter, then the writer is also disclosing the world with the aim of freedom for others. Part 2. Freedom and Liberation. An objection leveled against existentialism is that its notion of freedom is a mere abstraction, with no concrete content for action. This is precisely what Sartre was defending against when he wrote at the end of his magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, that he intended to develop an ethical program. However, he failed to complete it, and de Beauvoir took up the existentialist gauntlet in this book to explain that far from being merely theoretical, existentialists believe that freedom realizes itself only by engaging itself in the world and requires acts of behavior. She reiterates, to will freedom and to will to disclose being are one and the same choice. This line may be the motto of her book, given that she repeats it several times throughout the text. Extending the frontiers of our understanding and in that way furthering our beings are acts of freedom and requires freedom, which is why to maintain it, if not to further our freedom, is important, making them the same movement. We are able to surpass our being only if we are free. She distinguishes existence from being, the same way Heidegger did. Existence is to live, what being is a given state, so existence goes beyond mere being. Science, techniques, art, and philosophy are indefinite conquests of existence over being, she writes. They are indefinite in the sense that we cannot know for sure how they would turn out, and they are conquests in the sense of progress, where we surpass our current states. Unlike Hegel, she does not think that we will at some point in the future reach absolute knowledge, because there is simply no absolute fixed limit. Instead, for man, it is a matter of pursuing the expansion of his existence. She considers each field in turn, starting with science. If the aim of science is to attain some absolute state of knowledge where being is concretized, then it has failed. Instead, it needs to be a free engagement of thought in the given, aiming at each discovery not at fusion with the thing, but at the possibilities of new discoveries. By being free, by thinking freely, each scientific discovery is not to arrive at some final and complete state of knowledge, but to open up new possibilities, hence extending our possibilities of knowing further so that we can be free to know even more. Hence, the endeavor of science is in that way to extend our freedom. For techniques or technology, if efficiency through the saving of time and effort is its aim, then this goal is useless and absurd, since we cannot store such savings away because existence exists only by being spent. Modern technologies has not made us happier compared to earlier days when they did not exist, though such an argument is not relevant to her, since technology is not about saving time or giving us happiness. It is not a question of stopping the movement of life, it is a question of fulfilling it, she writes. Beauvoir sees the mission of technology not as allowing us to rest on our laurels, but to allow us to go even further. She moves on to the role of art. Art's role is not to set up idols, but to reveal existence as a reason for existing. Even as art captures and expresses a singular moment, it must continue to keep capturing and in that way to keep disclosing our existence to us over the ages. In that way, art helps us in our self-understanding and also serves as a historical record. Our constructive activities are meaningful only if they are movement towards freedom, with concrete outcomes such as discoveries, inventions, industries, culture, paintings, and books that can open up new possibilities for us. It is a dream for the future that everyone is free to undertake whatever constructive projects they desire to. But for now, there remains people who can justify their lives only by a negative action, which she has elaborated at length with the subman and its variants in Chapter 2. We all have an ontological freedom. We all transcend ourselves just by being alive. And yet some people are unable to pursue their projects positively, where their transcendence is condemned to fall uselessly back upon itself because it is cut off from its goals. Where does this oppression, this being cut off from their goals, come from? Oppression does not come from nature. People are never oppressed by things, but by other people, according to Beauvoir. The resistance that we encounter in things, in nature, is what in fact sustains our actions. Natural disasters and even our deaths are part of the natural condition of life. Where we work towards our goals and face such natural obstacles, we do not experience them as denials of our freedom. On the contrary, such setbacks, failures, withdrawals and errors are another way of disclosing the world, writes Beauvoir. The world is comprised of the natural and the artificial or the man-made. Only man can be an enemy for man, she writes. We can be robbed by other people of the meaning of our acts and of our lives, and such theft is what we must resist, since human oppression is not inevitable unlike natural obstacles. We may be helpless against earthquakes, but not against war or occupation. In a war, he must take sides for or against, and the foreign wills thereby become allied or hostile, she explains. Our connection with other people, this interdependence, explains why oppression is possible and why it is hateful. To fulfill our freedom, we need to be able to head towards an open future. We live among people and hence we need them to cooperate with me or at least not obstruct me so that I can head towards this open future. If they prevent me from making this movement, they are forcing me to consume my transcendence in vain, making me into a thing to be used for their purposes. Life is occupied in both perpetuating itself and in surpassing itself. If all it does is maintain itself, then living is only not dying, and human existence is indistinguishable from an absurd vegetation, writes Beauvoir. If we are merely alive but not existing by surpassing ourselves towards our goal, then we are not different from things. Here, Beauvoir's description of such a life is similar to Karl Marx's description of people who are alienated from their labor. Their work is a repetition of mechanical gestures. Their rest is merely for them to regain their strength so that they can work again, where the oppressor feeds himself on their transcendence and refuses to extend it by a free recognition. She believes there is only one way out, and that is for the oppressed to revolt. However, the oppressor may ameliorate the situation by portraying the circumstances leading to the workers' exploitation as natural, since after all, one cannot revolt against nature. They explain that inequality is natural. The domination of the strong over the weak is something we observe in the wild. They argue that they are not stealing from the worker, unlike what the revolutionary claims. However, this is an equivocation, since what the revolutionary means by words like theft and stealing is that the present regime is a human fact, not an outcome from nature, but one created by people and hence changeable. Beauvoir picks out Hegel's theory of the dialectical movement for criticism. The view of history through the lens of the dialectical movement seems to consider each epoch, each event as merely a stage that will be surpassed towards a higher level, such that each catastrophe, each man-made failure is a necessary staging for progress and part of a continuous and harmonious development. She cites with Marx that such thinking is an idealistic and verbose flabbiness divorced from material reality. Revolt is not just a stage of a harmonious dialectical movement, since it does not wish to be integrated, but rather to explode at the heart of the world and to break its continuity. According to Marx, the proletariat do not affirm themselves or seek to realize a classless society through positive action, but rather tries to end itself as a class. The slave does not know his servitude if he is mystified into thinking that slavery is not a man-made situation, but one that is given by nature, by the gods, by the powers against whom revolt has no meaning. It is for this reason that Marx made it his lifelong task to help the proletariat develop a class consciousness, to help them overcome this mystification born out of ignorance, so that they transcend their situation through revolt. Conservatives may argue that it is better for things to remain status quo to avoid disturbing the peace, and so no corrective action should be taken and any revolt should be put down. They question what right do people have to want freedom for others. Beauvoir demolishes these objections. The cause of freedom is not that of others more than it is mine. It is universally human. We want this universal freedom not just for other people's sake, but for our own. We want the slave to be aware of his servitude for his own sake, but also so that I do not have the opportunity to be an oppressor. Marx argues in the same way that capitalism is not just alienating for the workers, but also for the capitalists. It forces both the workers and the capitalists to act in ways that are inhumane. Abstention is complicity, and complicity in this case is tyranny, judges Beauvoir. To not act to end oppression is to be complicit in the evils of the status quo. The oppressor may retort that the oppressed wants their oppression. Beauvoir believes that this is a myth. If at all, the oppressed is merely abstaining simply because they do not think that freedom is possible, but she is willing to put it to a test. The real test will be to present the oppressed their freedom and allow them to decide freely. It is when he chooses freedom that the movement of emancipation really begins. Emancipation is to achieve freedom, and the oppressed need to desire for themselves their own freedom for their struggle to truly begin. While we all need freedom, de Beauvoir understands that the urgency is not the same for everyone. The most oppressed will have the most urgency, while those not in slavery or extreme oppression will still want to be more free, but for them, it is more a function of moral need than a life or death matter. The most oppressed can only fulfill their freedom through revolt, since their situation is preventing them from having any positive development. They have to engage in social and political struggle to regain their transcendence, while for the proletariat, his situation may not be so dire, and he may even forget that he wants his life to be meaningful. De Beauvoir explains how enlightened capitalism may trick a worker into such forgetting. He works in a factory in routine work which absorbs his transcendence, after which he is pacified with distractions such as sports, gadgets, autos, and Frigidaires. French and also a brand for refrigerators, she notes. As we move up the economic and social ladder, the bourgeois and the intellectuals have even less pressing needs for liberation, since they are able to self-actualize to a greater extent, though they can still use their freedom to cooperate in the struggle against oppression, since this recreation of the world which should be the task of every man if freedom were no longer enchained anywhere. Hence de Beauvoir believes that while the struggle is greater for the more oppressed, everyone is affected and is unable to fulfill himself morally without taking part in it. There can be multiple sources of oppression for some. Her example is the colonized, who are oppressed by the colonizers but also their own leaders. The orders and tactics for fighting these multiple sources depend on opportunity and efficiency, where some causes may have to temporarily take a backseat to more urgent ones. There can be also the case that the cause is so important that regardless of other crises, it is necessary to maintain the tension of revolt against a situation to which one does not wish to consent at any price, her example being the case of racial emancipation during the Second World War in America. Nonetheless, de Beauvoir cautions against the fanaticism of seriousness, which can cause a new oppression. Through his own struggle, he must seek to serve the universal cause of freedom, she writes. Different people face different oppressions which they struggle against, but there is solidarity between them since they are all struggling against oppression for the common cause of freedom. De Beauvoir runs through and dismantles a series of objections by the oppressors. The oppressors may object that in liberating the oppressor's freedom is itself being taken away. They are defending their freedom to enslave others, but de Beauvoir explains that they contradict themselves. When one chooses one's own freedom by denying the freedom of others, it is dishonest. We have to respect freedom only when it is intended for freedom. A freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied, she writes. The freedom of others is a condition for my own freedom. I am oppressed if I am enslaved, but not if I am prevented from enslaving others. According to de Beauvoir, such oppressors are aware of this false reasoning, and hence appeals instead to a defense of other values, such as a defense of the status quo, of civilization, of institutions, or of the past, which is why it is conservative. However, she thinks that to neglect the past is a mistake. The past concerns us not as a brute fact, but insofar as it has human signification. To maintain the past in hardened and mummified forms at the cost of the present and the future is to throw up a false choice, and hence is dishonest. The past is instead a living truth, an appeal towards the future which sometimes can save it only by destroying it. The past is not something to be preserved at all costs if it damages the future. To do so would be setting it up as an idol of the serious man. The oppressor may then invoke the future. De Beauvoir uses an example of the colonizer who sees himself as the only one capable of exploiting the wealth which the native would leave fallow, where he makes a utilitarian argument to secure future progress through exploitation. As she mentioned earlier, usefulness requires a complement. Useful for what? Nothing is useful if it is not useful for man, she writes. If we cannot define our own projects and values, and is forced to instead serve another person's project unwillingly, then it is not useful to us to the extent that the results are not commensurate with our oppression. There is an injustice. Doubtless an oppressive regime can achieve constructions which will serve man. They will serve him only from the day he is free to use them. As long as the reign of the oppressor lasts, none of the benefits of oppression is a real benefit, she writes. We must not prefer things to human beings, since it is human beings alone that can establish the reason for all things. This is the Kantian imperative not to treat others as means to achieve our own ends, but as ends in themselves. The last argument Beauvoir presents from the oppressors is how not all freedoms can be respected at the same time. While that may be true, it means that we must accept the tension of the struggle for freedom, that we must continue to seek to extend freedom and not give up making any efforts.